Party Foul presents War Machine and Hordes Boot Camp Video 1, Reading the Cards.
Hi, Greg here for Party Foul. We're going to talk to you about the Privateer Press War Machine and Hordes cards, the information that's on them, where you can find it, what it actually means. So we're going to start with a Warlock Warcaster card, and then we're going to go from there, and I'll talk about Warbeast Warjacks, and then units and attachments, and finally solos. So the first thing you want to look for is on the top right, there's a version code for the card. This one is 2016 version 1, you can see in the top right corner there. And that tells you if it's the latest version or not. So if you have two types of cards, or you see one that's online, that's a version 2. That'll be a more up-to-date version. Next, you want to look at the top of the card, and you're going to see the card's name, its faction, and what type of model it is. So in this case, it's Tanith the Feral Song, Circle Black-clad Warlock. Some of that information is pertinent because if a spell or an ability or a buff is a friendly faction, then it has to match the faction of the card that has that ability. So in this case, Tanith is a Circle Orboros model, and she's also a Black-clad. And that means that any abilities that buff Black-clads or affect Black-clads will also affect Tanith, because she is a Black-clad Warlock. Next, underneath the name and title of the card, you're going to see a stat block, and that is going to also be titled with the character's names. You see it says Tanith 1, and then below that it has a whole bunch of numbers that are related to what the model can do on the tabletop and how effective it is in melee and how effective it is at taking damage. So that is the stat block. The first number in that stat block is the speed, and that is the number of inches that the model can move during a normal full advance, and that would be 6 in Tanith's case, so she can move 6 inches. You can check out our video on how to move models on the tabletop for more information on that. The next number is strength, and that is to determine how strong the actual model is physically, and that is used for the occasional throw, or also you add that number to the power of any melee weapon that the model might have to determine the total power, the total capacity to damage models with that. And I'll discuss that later when we look at the weapons. The next chunk of the stat block is called the offensive block, and that has the model's melee attack rating and the model's ranged attack rating. So you can see Matt, that's the melee attack rating, is 6. And that is the number that you add to your 2d6 roll or your 3d6 roll if you boost to determine whether or not the attack is successful. The second one, the ranged attack rating, you use for ranged attack weapons, and I'll discuss that more when I get to the ranged weapons. The next two numbers are the defensive block of the model, and it has the defensive stat. It's DEF is defense or def, and following number is arm or armor. So defense is how difficult it is to successfully hit the model, and the armor is how resilient the model is to taking damage. And we'll discuss this in further videos, but basically you roll your 2d6 or your 3d6 if you're boosting and add the pertinent rating, whether it's melee attack, and you add the 6 for Tanith's melee attack rating, and you add it to the 2d6 or 3d6 roll, and if it equals or exceeds the def of the model, then you have hit the model. Likewise, to damage a model, you roll 2d6 or 3d6, depending or not it's boosted, and you add that to the POW of the weapon, and then you subtract the armor to determine how much damage the model takes. The command rating, the next number, is not always pertinent to a model, but some of them are. It is for buffs and abilities, and the command rating is the number of inches that this aura exists beyond the model, and this is measured in like a radius, so you measure 9 inches out from the model, and that goes every which direction. So if this model had an ability that gave another model +2 to its attack rolls within its command range, then that model that's receiving the buff would have to be within its command of 9 inches, or the model has to be 9 inches away from Tanith. And just below the stat block will be any specific icons that will be related to that model. And there's a variety of these, and we'll probably do a separate video on those, but that symbol there tells you that Tanith has Pathfinder, and that means that she does not suffer a movement penalty when she's moving through rough terrain. Okay, next up is the Fury stat for this model, and that is 6, you can see there, under the little circle underneath the illustration. And this is a very important number. This tells you how much Fury the model starts with, and how much Fury that model can leech from Warbeasts in its battle group. And this is also basically its magical rating for when it's casting offensive spells. And it can use Fury to transfer damage, or to heal, or to cast spells, or boost attack and damage rolls, or buy additional attack and damage rolls. So this particular model has a Fury stat of 6, and you also use the Fury stat to determine the model's control area, and the control area is 2 times the stat, the Fury stat. So in this case, it would be 6 times 2 would be 12, and that is the number of inches that the model's control area goes out past the model. So, for example, Tanith would have a control area of 12 inches, and that means that if she wanted to Leech Fury, or to force a War Beast, or to channel a spell through a model in its battle group during her feat, that model would have to be in her control area of 12 inches. So, very important stat for this particular type of model. The next area of the card that I'm going to draw your attention to are the weapon stats that the model has. And every model has different types of weapons, so they'll be listed in those little blocks down there. There's 2 weapons that are listed on Tanith's card, and we're going to look at the first one, the Jaws of Earth. You can see the name above there, and then there's a whole bunch of information below, and I'm going to go through that individually. So the Jaws of Earth is a ranged attack. You can see that because it's got that little green gun icon that tells you that it's ranged, and its range is 10 inches, and that means that the distance between Tanith and her target needs to be no further than 10 inches. So 10 inches is the maximum effective range of the weapon. And the ROF, or the rate of fire of the weapon, tells you how many times that weapon can fire during the model's activation. And the next one is AoE, or area of effect. And this will tell you if the weapon has a blast that is related to it, whether it's a 3-inch or a 4-inch or a 5-inch. This particular one has an asterisk, and that's because there's a special ability that procs on it that will cause models in an AoE to have an effect, but it's not actually an AoE in terms of damage related effects. The next one is the POW of the weapon, and that tells you how strong the weapon is in terms of its ability to damage other models. And like I said, you add this particular stat to the 2d6 roll or 3d6 roll if you're boosting, and then you compare that to the target's armor to determine how much damage the target takes. And under each weapon, you'll see there'll be a number of icons, or if there are related special abilities, there will be icons underneath to tell you what those abilities are. In this particular case, Tanith's Jaws of the Earth is a magical weapon. That's what that icon means, and that means that it can damage incorporeal models and any other models that are immune to non-magical weapons. Below that, she has the Staff of Fate. You can see that name there, and it is a melee weapon. That's what that sword, the sort of red-orange sword icon means. It's a melee weapon, and is related to all the melee rules. And melee range is the next one, the RNG. That tells you the range of the melee attack. That's the distance between Tanith and her target, and that's how far she can basically reach over and smack somebody in the head. In this case, it's 2 inches, and there are some fantastic widgets and stuff like that that you can use to determine whether or not the target is in her melee range. The next stat is the POW of the weapon, and that tells you basically how powerful the weapon is. And in the case of melee weapons, you add the POW and the strength of the model together so that you get the total PNS. That's when people say PNS, that's what they mean, the total POW of the weapon. In this case, it's 11. You can see that that's a total of the strength and the POW of the weapon. This is the model strength and the POW of the weapon to give you a total of 11 for the POW. And also, there are any related special abilities to that weapon. It'll be put on like little icons. In addition, any information that's on the back of the front of this first card. This one, once again, is a magical icon, so it tells you that her Staff of Fate is a magical weapon. And then down at the bottom, we have her damage boxes, and PP breaks up their damage grids into groups of 5. And you'll notice that the last damage box is a heart. That is a damage box. So Tanith has a total of 15 damage boxes. That means she can take 15 damage before she succumbs to her wounds and is dead. Then below that, there'll be a little gray box, very small, and it says War Beast points. And it'll be a number underneath that. And in this case, it says plus 31. And that means that these are the number of points that you get in addition to whatever size of battle that you're using. So if you're playing a 0-point game, then you will be playing with Tanith, the Warlock, and 31 points of War Beasts. If you're playing a 75-point game, you'll be playing with Tanith, plus 31 points of War Beasts, and 75 additional points that you can use on whatever you want. Privateer Press kind of uses this as a balancing factor. So if they feel a caster is not as a little weaker than other casters, then they can kind of balance that out by giving them a few more War Beast points. And besides that, this little brown box here is FA, which means force allocation. This basically means the number of this type of model that you can use in your army. In this case, it says C, which means character, which means there can only be one instance of this model in your army. And that makes a lot of sense because it's a warlock. And you usually only use one warlock unless you're playing especially big games. Okay, before we get to the back of the first card for Tanith, we're going to compare her to a Warcaster card. And there's not a lot of differences, but I'm going to go through it anyways just to make sure that it's clear for everybody. You got your version number there just to make sure that the card is up to date, and the name and faction of the card. And below that, you have Kray's stat block and all the pertinent information there. And then just below his stat block, you have the relevant icons for his special abilities. In this case, he's a cavalry model. That's that horse head. And then he's got Parry, the crossed swords, and then Pathfinder, the little boot thing. And then below that, you have his weapons. And he's got a ranged weapon called Radcliffe Carbine. And he's got Bitter End, his melee weapon. And then below that, you have a mount attack, and that is specific to cavalry models and is only usable by cavalry models, and we'll cover that in a cavalry video. And it's just important to note that models can have multiple melee attacks with different melee ranges. As you can see, Kray's Bitter End has a range of 1 inch, and his mount has a 0.5 melee range. So make sure you take a look at those range for the melee attacks and make them only at the ranges that you're allowed. He has his focus stat, and that is exactly, similar to the Fury stat in that it determines his control area and the number of focus that he starts each turn with. And he can use that focus to cast spells, or to allocate to his warjacks, or to use to prevent damage to himself, that type of thing. And just like Fury, his control area is 2 times his focus stat, which would be 6 times 2 would be 12 inches. And that means that for his feet and for the allocation to warjacks and that type of thing, models relating to those abilities would have to be in his control range. So they'd have to be 12 inches away from Kray. And then below that, you have his damage boxes, and he has 18 damage boxes. And then his warjack points, as opposed to his warbeast points, but it's identical in the sense that it's a balancing sort of factor. And then if you're playing a 0-point game, you would play with Kray and 30 points of warjacks. Or if you're playing a 75-point game, you'd play with Kray, 30 points of warjacks, and then 75 points of whatever you want. And then the FA, or force allocation limit, and because he's a character, you can only have 1 of him in your list. Okay, on to the back of the Warlock or Warcaster's first card, and you can see at the top it has the caster's name, just so you don't get mixed up in case they're living in a war room or something like that. Below that, you'll see that they sort of break things up by having a bold, capital, underlined title, and then below that, they have all of the pertinent abilities that are related to that particular item. So the first one on this is Tanith 1, and Prowl is one of the abilities that is related to her. And then below that, you have Jaws of Earth, which is a ranged attack, and then all the abilities and related special abilities related to the Jaws of the Earth. And then below the Jaws of the Earth, you have the Staff of Fate, which is her melee weapon, and everything related to that particular melee weapon. So it's all broken up very clearly with the name and what special abilities are related to that particular thing, so it doesn't confuse you. Okay, on to the second card, the first front of the second card, you have the spell list. And at the top, you have the name of the character, just so you don't get confused. And then you can see at the top of that bracket, it has basically a chart, and you have spells, cost, range, AoE, POW, duration, or dur, and offensive. So the first part of the sort of column is the spells, and that tells you, you can see they're in bold, and that's all the spells that are related to that particular character. The next column is the cost, and that is the cost in Fury if it's a Warlock, or Focus if it's a Warcaster. And you can see they all have a related cost in Focus or Fury. And then range, and range is measured in the number of inches. So if the caster is using it, say this is Tanith, and Tanith is casting Admonition, then the target for that spell needs to be 6 inches away from Tanith. Or if she's using it through an arc node, the distance from the arc node to the target needs to be the related range, so in this case 6 inches. After that, there's AoE, which is just like weapons, where it's an area of effect. And if the weapon or the magical attack has an AoE, it'll be stated there. So you can see that Rift, the fourth spell listed there, has an AoE of 4, and that means there's a 4-inch blast that is centered on the target. Or if it misses, then you deviate a 4-inch blast. The next column is POW, and that is if it is an offensive spell and if it's capable of damaging a model, then it will have a related POW, and that works just like damage from weapons and melee attacks. The next is duration. D-U-R means duration. And if it says up, as you can see in the top there, admonition, that means it's an upkeep spell. And that means that the caster can just pay 1 focus or fury during the control phase to upkeep that spell. And it stays up until it expires or is removed from the play or something like that. The next down, you can see it says round for Rift. That means that if you read below, it says that the AoE stays in play for 1 round. and that means that you play the player turn, and then the following player turn is considered one round. Another duration could be turn if that was on there. None of these particular spells have turn as a duration. Next is OFF, and that means offensive, and it's basically a simple yes or no answer, whether it's offensive or not. If it's an offensive spell, then that means an attack roll needs to be made using the caster's focus or fury stat plus a 2d6 or 3d6 roll if you're boosting against the target's defense. If it's not an offensive spell, then there is no need to roll to put the spell on the target. So you can see that each of the spells are broken up as a block. Admonition has all the pertinent text available to it, plus its cost, range, AoE, POW, duration, offensive. So it's fairly easy to read once you get used to looking at it. Finally, the second half of the second card of a Warlock or Warcaster's 2-card pairing is the Feat. And a Feat is a very powerful, special, one-time ability that a Warcaster or Warlock can use once per game. And you can see at the top there it says the Warlock's name, Tanith the Feral Song, and as the Feat, the title of the Feat, and then a little blurb, story-like blurb, tells you kind of like what happens in a fictitious type of way, and then it has a blurb underneath that tells you what actually happens in the game in terms of the gameplay. And it's important to note that some spells are used to check out your feats and make sure that you read it carefully, because sometimes it'll say while, and sometimes it'll say models currently in somebody's control area, and that will make a difference between whether it is a pulse type feat, and a pulse type feat will be like models currently, so the feat will go out and it'll affect those models only, and then it will no longer be affected. But if it says while, or if it says models activating in, so it's such and such's control area, then that means it's an aura, and it's not a pulse. It's constantly in effect, and it'll tell you the duration of it later. So make sure you read it very carefully and talk about it with other players to make sure you're playing it correctly. Sometimes it'll say additionally, so there'll be different parts of a feat. Like I said, read feats very carefully. And then finally, it'll tell you the duration of the feat. This one in particular lasts one turn. That means on the turn that it's used, it'll be in effect, and then after that, it has no effect whatsoever. And that's it for the Warlock Warcaster card summary. Be sure to check out the other summaries on Warbeast Warjack cards and units.